continue in English since our closing keynote comes all the way from Long Island, New York. I'm very honored to introduce Greg Verdino to you. Hi, Greg. Greg is a highly regarded authority on what we call the digital now. He's known for his uncanny ability to forecast trends and to spot the difference between fads and the future. For 30 years now, Greg has worked at the forefront of change and advising many companies and a lot of Fortune 500 companies as well. As a co-author of the Adapt Manifesto, Greg is leading a movement to align leaders around a core set of principles that help organizations reliably and repeatedly adapt to the changing environment in which they operate. Well, throughout his career, Greg has served as an expert for a wide range of media, well-known like Bloomberg, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. So it's fair to say Greg is a pretty busy man, and besides all this work, he's also found some time to write books. Marketeers are probably familiar with his bestseller about micro-marketing. Get big results by thinking and acting small. And recently, he published a book. It's called Never Normal. And if I could say that correctly, it distills 8 years of Greg's most provocative ideas about technology, about transformation, and about innovation. And I think, Greg, well, I'm not sure. Yeah. A little endorsement here. This is the book. Okay, so today, through his work, speaking, writing, and consulting on digital strategy, Greg helps business leaders build thriving and future-ready companies. Well, according to Greg, the answer to disruption is not technology, but humanity. And I think that addresses the theme we are addressing this evening. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you, all the way from New York City, Mr. Greg Verdino. The floor is yours, Greg.
Great. Thank you so much, Hans. Thank you to everybody. Well, first of all, thank you, Hans, for switching to English before I lost track. I may be the only person that appreciated that, but I did appreciate it. And thank you to everybody, of course, for choosing to spend some time with us here this evening with fellow digitals, with Kamalis earlier, having a great breakout, and of course now ending the night with me. I think maybe earlier on, Kamalis spoke a little bit about the concept of a next normal. And it's, of course, very common for those of us who work in the space of transformation or change or even innovation to think about the reality that the old normal is gone, and to think that perhaps a new normal or a next normal may be emerging. But as Hans referenced, I tend to think of it a little bit differently. And this really particularly kind of came to me in 2020 when it occurred to me that we should not be expecting, as business people or as people in general, should not be expecting that a new normal is going to merge, at least not anytime soon, and that the reality we will all be living in for the foreseeable future is what I call the never normal. And it's this period of unrelenting, accelerating change that will happen in virtually every area in which we live and across all the different areas in which our businesses operate. And that ultimately we need to teach our organizations and the people in our organizations and ourselves even to thrive in the face of this unrelenting change. And that's what it will mean to succeed in the never normal. So I'd like to dive in now, and I want to actually start by bringing us back a decade or so into the 2010s. The 2010s to me were the digital decade. And I'm not saying digital is dead. Of course, today digital is not dead. And I'm not necessarily even saying that many of the things we recognize as digital technologies were not around long before 2010. But I do think it's fair to say that in the 2010s, that was the decade during which the things that we take for granted as the milestones of our modern era made their way into the mainstream and became prevalent across all different areas. Significantly, it's the decade during which the technology giants, the big boys, big tech, pushed companies like oil companies and banks out of the top positions in any ranking, virtually any ranking of the world's most valuable businesses. It's the decade that came to, brought us the FANG economy, named for Facebook, Amazon, sometimes Apple, Netflix, and Google. These companies that entered, redefined, and came to dominate so many different industries and came to ultimately drive economic value in ways that in many cases were unprecedented. Organizations that, individually were more valuable in some cases than entire industries, right? This was an entirely new world with an entirely new competitive landscape. And this doesn't mean, of course, that incumbent organizations, traditional companies in traditional industries were sitting still, because the 2010s were also the years during which most organizations developed their digital transformation plans, where digital transformation became the hot boardroom topic. And every organization had a plan of one sort or another. Now, in many cases, those plans were overly reliant on technology. They mistook technology for transformation. And as Hans said, and of course, in keeping with the theme of this event, I've always believed that digital transformation was first and foremost fundamentally human transformation, not just technology nips and tucks around the edges of the business. It's driven by people, it's enacted by people, it calls for human involvement in every way, in every area across the organization, if you want transformation to succeed. But at least every organization had some kind of a plan. But anytime I hear about plans or think about plans, it calls to mind my favorite modern philosopher, a man named Michael Gerard Tyson, who famously said that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And of course, COVID, when we went from the 2010s into 2020s, COVID was a real punch in the mouth for all of us. And the plans that we developed carefully, meticulously, put on paper in the years leading up to the pandemic, not knowing the pandemic would hit us the way it did, those plans became virtually irrelevant almost overnight. And it forced us, this forced us to rethink and reimagine. Even a year later, things were not back to normal, as you know, and this image of Times Square on New Year's Eve 2021, as a New Yorker, really encapsulates this for me. Who thought we would ever see this in our lifetime? It's eerie, it's shocking, right? And of course, everybody around the world experienced their version of this all through 2020 into 2021. I don't need to tell you all of this, but the world, of course, wasn't really standing still. And you know that, of course. For the tech giants in particular, this was a boom time, right? They became the literal lifeline that all of us needed. They became our connectivity to the outside world. It's how we got any product we wanted delivered to our doorstep. It's how we had access to our social interactions, to information, to entertainment. The big truly got bigger in the face of the pandemic. And this doesn't mean, of course, that there weren't some success stories in the world of traditional organizations either. We certainly saw, and you felt it, you lived it, you did it. Every organization did something in the face of the pandemic. As Satya Nadella from Microsoft, their CEO, during an earnings call in the early part of 2020, pointed out that we saw 2 years of digital transformation in just 2 months. And while that's true enough from my perspective, that's consistent with my experience. From my point of view, it looked a lot less like most organizations leaping 2 years into the future, quite frankly, and more like most organizations were finally catching up on the past 2 years of change. It's no surprise, I don't think, to anybody in business that consumers, our customers, often our employees, are ahead of our organizations in adopting new technologies. And in a way, the pandemic forced organizations to reckon with that in a way that was much more real than the sort of the boardroom blitz around transformation ever was. Organizations had to change, right? We all had to deal with the idea of remote work, which ultimately could cause us to rethink the workplace and the workforce. I don't believe that we will ever be going back to a 5-day work week, at least not on a widespread basis for white collar or knowledge-based work. I don't believe we'll stay remote forever, but I believe that the future of work will look radically different. At the same time, of course, organizations accelerated automation in a lot of different areas. So a little bit of heaven and hell, the catch-22, right? You can work from home. That's the good news. The bad news is we may no longer have a need for your services, but we've found a way for technology to do what you do. And we've even seen that play out on, sort of in traditionally human areas of work. That's what this example shows. Deep fakes, essentially digital humans providing corporate training at certain organizations instead of sending human trainers around from office to office because they couldn't. At the same time, some traditional organizations were able to really make substantial strides in their journey from analog to digital. For the first time ever in April 2020, Walmart's grocery app was the #1 shopping app based on downloads in the mobile app stores, at least here in the US. More than Amazon, topping Amazon for the first time ever. And of course, Walmart is huge in the brick and mortar world, but Amazon has always been the 800-pound online gorilla, as we know that. So all of a sudden, Walmart has an opportunity to compete at scale online with Amazon because they have a much larger installed base. Companies like Disney, of course, experimenting with new models. They can't get people into theme parks or into theaters. They've moved to subscriptions. Even the movie studios finally cracking the code on simultaneous cross-platform distribution. Streaming movies have been technically possible for decades. I was in the streaming business probably close to 20 years ago. There is no reason other than financial incentive that the studios couldn't have done this years ago, giving their own customers more control over when, where, and how they experience the product on their own terms. It might have even been good for the studios years ago. Never did it. COVID hits and voila, all of a sudden, every studio in the world has figured out how to go straight to streaming. Right, so these things have all happened, and here's maybe the weirdest example. American Airlines, planes are grounded. They have a warehouse full of first-class wine bottles. They've started a wine club, I guess, for anybody that wants to enjoy warm Chardonnay from the comfort of their home, right? So, I mean, this is a weird example, but a sign of the kinds of things organizations can do when they're faced with a healthcare crisis that turns into essentially an economic crisis for them. The need to accelerate transformation, if no other reason than to survive in the face of the current reality that all of our organizations are dealing with. But of course, organizations must do more than just survive, because we're not going back in time, right? We can't spin the clock back and go back to the old normal. We can't go back to doing business the way we've always done business. Some things, sure, planes will eventually take to the air again. Other things, back in the office 5 days a week, de-automating or unautomating the things we've already automated, probably not going to happen, right? So we can't go back in time. We can only move forward. And it becomes imperative to think about how organizations move forward and what we move forward into. And I believe that technology, in many ways digital, will be the least of all of the significant shifts and changes and waves of change that organizations will have to grapple with in the coming years. So I'm not saying by any way, shape, or form, I am not saying that the march of technology will not continue. Technology will continue to accelerate at an exponential pace, and that will continue to reshape the relationship between human and machines, the shape and the, sort of the architecture of our organizations, the way we think about our workforce and the role of people in our workforce, the way we tap into and deploy technologies across our enterprises to gain a competitive strategic advantage, or to collaborate more effectively, or to deliver a wholly new customer experience. Yes, this will happen, but this will not be the only thing that's happening. And to think that digital alone is going to be the most transformative factor or challenge for our organizations starts to look even a little bit quaint. As we think about the future, and we think about even the things we're beginning to see emerge today, because we will see a series, I'm sure, of biological forces come into play. COVID, of course, is an example of that. We will continue to see economic challenges, waves of economic change. Of course, the current economic uncertainty is part of that. That's the front end of it. So is the widening gap between the 1% richest in the world and everybody else. I would not be surprised if I were you to see capitalism, at least in its current form, increasingly being called into question, for our customers even to start to call for a realignment of companies around purpose, not just profit, right? These things are likely to happen in the coming years. We're going to see continued social and cultural changes around the world of all different kinds. What is the next Black Lives Matter? What is the next Me Too movement? What is the next thing that will cause your customers or your employees to say, no, not on my time and not with my dime? Certainly rising geopolitical tensions, the trade war that turned into an outright economic Cold War between the US and China, perfect example, and certainly that's not going away anytime soon. And at the end of the day, the climate crisis is going to make all of these things pale in comparison, right? Those will be the warm-up act to global warming, which will have fundamental impacts on every organization and every individual in ways that probably many people can't even imagine. So, as I said, disruption will be prevalent. It will be pervasive. It will be ubiquitous. Waves of disruption will accelerate, but it will not just be digital disruption. And that's where, in my sense, in some ways, looking at transformation as predominantly a digital phenomenon falls a little bit short. And we need to be thinking more broadly and thinking about the idea of always on adaptability, because in the never normal, when everything is changing all the time, it is adaptability that will give organizations a competitive advantage. To me, adaptability in my sense, as I think about it, it's not about mere survival. It's about adapting to thrive. It's not about the long, slow slog of biological evolution. It's about closing the gap between where an external event happens and the rapid response your organization and the people in it can have to that event, so that you essentially accelerate your organization's capacity for change. So I want to kind of give a little bit of background here. This is, not a technology change. It is absolutely a cultural change. And probably over the course, and I think Hans hinted at this some, over the course of my time working in digital, I've probably worked on, I don't know how many, hundreds of different digital programs, projects, strategies, campaigns, whatever, change initiatives for dozens of different organizations in virtually every industry: automotive, banking, insurance, retail, entertainment, music, media, government, nonprofit. And what I found was that it was never technology that held the organization back. It was always culture. It was always the human elements inherent in any transformation that would present the biggest obstacles. And one of the largest obstacles many of these organizations face, particularly large organizations and organizations who tend to be incumbents in their industry, established businesses, is that they've essentially lost their capacity for change readiness. They've grown up to be robust and reliable, but speed has been sacrificed. The ability to not only move quickly, but also move with purpose and to change deliberately and progressively and aggressively sometimes falls by the wayside. You optimize around the things you do really well, and you keep doing them better and better every single day. And there's a lot of value in that. But there's also a lot of value in change readiness. And that often, even when a company had the right strategy, access to the best technology, an inability to change or a lack of a change readiness would often hold that organizations back and cause their change initiatives to fail. So a colleague and I started looking at what separated the winners from the losers, the clients we worked with who were able to effectively change and those who were not. And we identified a set of 7 values and 10 principles that we ultimately memorialized, as Hans said, in something we called the Adapt Manifesto, which I think Hans introduced it probably better than I could off the top of my head. But the way we think about it is what the Agile Manifesto did for software development, the Adapt Manifesto aims to do for adaptive business. I want to share a few of the principles. I'm not going to share all of the principles or the values. One of the values, frankly, incidentally, by the way, in keeping with tonight's theme, is humans before technology. I think that almost speaks for itself. But I do want to share some of the principles. You can always find the principles online at adaptmanifesto.org. It is a not-for-profit initiative. The manifesto is shared under Creative Commons. I make no money from it. It's there basically for the taking, for organizations to implement in whole or in part, and to interpret as they see fit for their own change readiness programs. But I do want to share some principles here. The other thing that I think before I dive into the first of these few principles, though, is I want to point out when we developed the Adapt Manifesto, we had organizational change in mind, but it became evident as we documented the principles and began to apply these principles with some of our clients that, in addition to being about organizational imperatives, these principles also speak to personal accountability. Many of them are about what we as humans in the business can do, and in some cases need to do, in order to ensure that our business remains competitive in the never normal future. So I do want you to think of these things through the lens of, what does this mean for me? How do I apply this in my day-to-day work? How can I get the people in my organization to embrace this idea and to themselves apply it in their work? In fact, and I'm not going to share these are not among the principles I was going to share, but we talk about in the manifesto walking the walk, that every leader needs to have ownership over transformation, whether it's on their business card or their job description or not, and needs to model the behaviors that they hope to see play out across their entire organization, and that they need to create an environment that lets or gets everybody on board, that the culture is inclusive and open, and kind of lets everybody have a voice, from the boardroom down to the break room, because this is important. It is a company-wide movement, in essence, to make change happen effectively. So the first of the principles, actually, before I share the principles, I forgot I had this slide in here. While we were working on the Adapt Manifesto, coincidentally, Forrester was also looking at adaptability. And they did a lot more research, frankly, than we would have done. And what they found through their research was that adaptive companies, as they define them, grow 3.2 times faster than their industry peers. So that's the why, right? There is financial benefit to adaptability. And our manifesto is sort of a how do you make it happen at the ground level by building a foundation for change readiness. Now finally, I will jump into a few of our principles and share some of my thinking, and share maybe even some examples. So the first principle I want to share is something we called in the manifesto learn, unlearn, relearn, repeat, which we frankly more or less stole, I like to say borrowed, from the futurist Alvin Toffler, who said that literacy in the 21st century will be fundamentally about learning, unlearning, and relearning. We added repeat because of the fundamental reality that with the rate at which technology and everything else changes around us, we can never stop learning. We will always need to be acquiring new skills to remain real and relevant, and as workers to be engaged and employable and fulfilled in the work we do. So really, this principle calls for everybody to be a lifelong learner. If digital transformation or transformation in general is among the corporation's priorities, then among the greatest challenges is going to be the people side. There will be I think in many ways, almost a reskilling crisis. We will need to reskill millions upon millions, ultimately billions of people. And we're going to need to do it again and again and again and again. Migrant workers in India, thousands upon thousands of them, took online courses after the pandemic hit, when it became risky, if not certainly risky, but probably the work wasn't even there to go out and do physical labor in the real world. Took online courses to learn how to do electronics repair so that they would remain employable in the face of the pandemic. Now that doesn't mean that the individual has total accountability. I want to be clear that organizations, of course, need to be on the hook for this too. It is a shared responsibility. Walmart, who I already mentioned once within the context of mobile shopping, probably the world's largest employer, 1.5 million employers here in the States. They have made a commitment to reskill 1 million of those workers. And I'm not saying that they're going to turn them all into data scientists and AI engineers, right? But they are reskilling all of those workers so that they remain employable in doing work that is more technologically driven, requires a greater use of digital tool sets. But that's actually the easy part of reskilling, because over time, technology itself is going to take on more and more of our technical tasks. And the technical skills we gain will become increasingly perishable. And I don't believe, I've never believed, and I'll say it here, I've said it in other places, that machines will take jobs away from humans outright. But I do believe that people who know how to work with machines will take the jobs away from people who don't. Everybody, of course, needs to have a constantly sort of constant technological skill, digital skill, upskilling. But more importantly, it's the human skills that will be more durable. And it sounds like, well, of course, we have human skills. We know all these things, but I think we need to reassert their value in business to a large extent. Skills like creativity, empathy, community, conversation, innovation, the ability to make decisions in the face of uncertainty, resilience, even adaptability itself is a human skill that I think many individuals will need to essentially understand how to now employ in a new and different way to differentiate the value they bring to the organization versus the value that a machine brings in terms of doing the rote, the repeatable, the routine. So that's kind of learn, unlearn, relearn, repeat. One area in which I think we all need to up our learning is in an area that I call becoming a student, or being a student of change. And I know that you've got a lot on your plate. There's plenty of work to do. It is very difficult, I know, for a lot of leaders and corporations to step out of the day-to-day. You have weekly, monthly, quarterly numbers to hit. You've got people to manage. You've got all of these pressing issues you need to deal with day to day. It's incredibly difficult, but incredibly powerful to be able to step away and scan the horizon, look outside your industry, look more than 3, 6, or 12 months out, and understand how is change happening around me? Where is that change coming from? And what might I do about that change as it's happening? How can I prepare for it and get my organization ready for it so that we don't fall further and further behind? One of the areas, but just one of the areas where this is particularly important is in sort of the way the boundaries are blurring between industries, right? It used to be a technology company was a technology company, a bank was a bank, right? And of course, that's not true anymore. Apple is in the payments business, and their credit card experience is like nothing I've experienced with any other credit card I hold, right? Sony is road testing their Vision S automobile on the roads in Austria this year. And I don't think they're ever going to actually mass produce this car and sell it to drivers. But it is loaded with mobility technologies, from entertainment and gaming systems, because the car will be self-driving eventually, to self-driving systems and all of the sensors that will require, right? And Sony, who's always been to a degree in the mobility business, right? They made the Walkman and the Discman, want to make sure that they are a viable player in the future mobility market as cars become shared and cars become self-driving. Amazon just last week here in the States announced that they're expanding their internal telehealth and home healthcare service, Amazon Care, throughout the United States, making it available to any individual or organization that wants to have or offer this to their employees. When you think about the fact that Amazon also has Amazon Pharmacy to fulfill and deliver to the door your prescriptions, they're creating a vertically integrated healthcare brand here, right? They used to be the bookstore, right? Is this the same company? It is, right? They used to be the bookstore. Now they host all of your business critical applications. Next, they're going to take care of your health, right? And these kinds of changes are coming from everywhere, happening everywhere. And these are just a few examples. Related to being a student of change, really studying the future and understanding its implications, is a concept that we called, or a principle we called, embrace ambiguity. Business used to be predominantly about the knowns, right? And as change accelerates and becomes more prevalent and more ubiquitous, business becomes increasingly about the unknowns. And it's less clear that how we've always done business is the way we should be doing business. As Hans said, and I know he said it in English in the middle of his Dutch introduction, the way you've always done business becomes the way you go out of business. And we can't let that happen to our own organizations. That's not good for anybody, right? So embracing ambiguity is really about having the courage. It's a mindset more than a skill set. Having the courage to make decisions and take action, even in the face of incomplete information. Because increasingly we have to deal with the unknowns. And among the unknowns, of course, are the true unknowns, right? The proverbial or the so-called black swan events, right? These things that are massive and sudden, sometimes catastrophic. They come out of nowhere. They surprise everybody. They change the landscape. It's like the COVID crisis. Certainly the pandemic was a black swan, a financial, a stock market crash, a volcano eruption, whatever, these black swans, right? And for many organizations, these black swans are actually catastrophic. They have damaging effects, but some innovators, game changers, look to these black swans as opportunities to create new value. Alibaba came out of the SARS outbreak in China when Chinese were afraid to go to the store. E-commerce was born in the country of China. Both Airbnb and Uber came out of the 2010 financial crisis when people were looking for better value for money, when they were open to the idea of accessing things instead of owning them, when they even wanted to assert a little bit more control over companies and kind of control over how they consume, right? So think about it. What are the game-changing innovations that will come out of the COVID crisis? I'm sure there will be many. Which of those will be in your industries? How can you change the game coming out of the COVID crisis? The next concept, though, is kind of tempers that a little bit. We call it the power of and. And, if you are an incumbent organization, you're not an Uber, you're not an Airbnb. I'm never one to advocate like you must become a startup or be a startup or like a startup or you're becoming a technology company. You might have elements of any of those or all of those things, but you were never just that, right? If you have an existing business, if you have customers, if you have revenue, if you have a brand, if you have a reputation, you don't want to do anything in your transformation journey that's going to jeopardize those things if they still work for you. Anything that doesn't work, get rid of it. Don't waste the time, the energy, the resources, the manpower, whatever. Get rid of the things that don't work for you and don't work for your customers. But by all means, you don't want to adapt in one area to the detriment of another area where you're seeing success. Are you a bank or are you a fintech? The answer is yes. Are you an automaker or a mobility services company? The answer is yes. Are you a hardware company or a software company? The answer is yes. For any incumbent organization, the answer is always going to be and. It's about how you balance the old things that still work for you with the new things that you could be doing and experimenting with, and how do those form the two halves or two parts at least of a more relevant, more resonant, more resilient, and more adaptable whole. To me, that's a core concept. The next one is in a way related to that. It's a concept that we called revolution through evolution. And it came from this insight we had that many of the largest organizations that undergo or attempt to undergo the largest transformations fail. 70% of all transformations fail. And that's from, according to, BCG, and I've seen it from other sources like McKinsey as well, comparable numbers. 70% fail. And it's typically because organizations try to change too much too quickly. And their transformation initiatives crumble under the weight of all that change. It also, when you think of the sheer scale of transformation, for large companies at least, it's frightening. It scares the board, it scares the shareholders, it scares the employees. It often grinds organizations to a halt. I guess to kind of paraphrase Alvin Toffler again a little bit, it's kind of future shock, his core concept in action. Too much change in too little time causes people to essentially stop in a state of shock. They're frozen in shock. So either organizations do too much and they crumble. GE was a great example of that. They were the poster child for digital transformation. Then they became the pariah. Or they do nothing or not enough because they just don't know where to start, or it's just it's too big of a burden. What we saw to be far more successful were the organizations that had a steady stream of smaller change initiatives that were taken strategically, step by step, persistently and consistently over time. That over time, they would add up to massive transformation for the organization. Any one of them might seem small, but when you put them all together and looked at the organization at the end of a journey versus their beginning, the organizations were radically transformed. And again, this doesn't mean go slow. It does mean go steady. It's a deliberate Darwinism. It's proactive. It's stepping into change, and it's testing, it's learning, and it's scaling once you know what works for the organization. And to me, this is the heart of adaptability, always on change readiness, and it is the key to a successful transformation. And that's the last principle I want to share, but I want to kind of close out by issuing a challenge to all of you. I want you to think about what is your ability to sense change while it's happening out at the edges before it moves into the mainstream, and to see the new and the novel before they become the norm. And then think about what it means for you yourself as a leader in your organization and for your team, what it means for your organization as a whole, what it can mean for your industry, and what it can mean potentially even for the entire world. And then act with conviction. do it faster and smarter, even than the change in the outside world requires you to do. Because I believe that this is this is fundamentally what it takes to adapt to thrive in the face of unrelenting, always on, accelerating change, to essentially adapt to thrive in what I call the never normal. So my name again is Greg Verdino. I want to thank you all for your time today. I appreciate you staying up late. I think it's late there, to attend this event with me and fellow digitals and everybody else who's been involved. I believe that Agneta is going to join me if we have a few questions. So thank you very much for your time.
Greg, not Agneta, sorry for that. But as you said, change is needed. Huh? Yes.
And this is a change.
I think it's all about adaptability, about change. Yeah, thank you very much for that very energetic and powerful presentation in the late evening here, as you said. So I have a few questions. I think the first one was about what you said about the change readiness and about it's not cultural, it's cultural, not technical. I think the first question from Robert is about that one. And he says, humans always had the need for change. The biggest change is the speed we are changing. Will the increase of speed continue, or will we realize that we maybe should slow down the increase of change?
You know, it's interesting. I think that I'm going to answer it in a few different ways, right? The rate of change, I believe, in virtually every area, and even if you want to discount everything except technology, absolutely technology is only going to accelerate, right? You know, I sometimes say, you know, we could see 100 years of change happen in the next 10 years, right? So we can't ignore that, right? And we do need to accelerate our organizations and ensure that the people in our organizations have the ability to change quickly. Otherwise, we will continue, both as companies and people, to fall further and further behind the world as it changes around us. That said, there is, and you know, this is, again goes to the idea of adaptability versus kind of big bang transformation. That if success requires the organization to slow down a little bit in the interest of ensuring that change succeeds, then the organization absolutely should. One of the things I think about, right, in the last, pre-pandemic, right, in the last few years of the 2010s, digital transformation became urgent for many organizations across many industries. Let's take retail, for example. Even when the pandemic hit, many brick and mortar retailers were stuck with shelf after shelf of unsellable product. So they clearly had not done enough up to that point to adapt their organizations to the reality of e-commerce, right? They said, well, e-commerce is what, 12%, 20%, no big deal. We'll have our online store, but we're optimized around physical brick and mortar. We're in the shopping malls, we're on the high street or whatever. And then they got stuck with product. But think about the fact that Amazon, right? Amazon was, kind of bit the e-commerce bug, launched the business in what, 1990, whatever, right? E-commerce had been developing for close to 20 years by the time the pandemic hit. Had retailers, I'm getting to kind of slow versus fast again, had retailers began making incremental strides towards e-commerce 20 years ago, they wouldn't have been stuck with shelf loads of unsellable product in 2020. So the reason why I'm saying that is, to me, that's preferable than a mad dash when it's too late. So I would say, and another way to think about speed is thinking ahead, and this is where, being a student of change matters, is if you can, kind of develop an understanding of what the next 10 years might bring for your industry, right? Embrace ambiguity. Nobody knows, we can't predict. But if you can develop a point of view on what the next 10 years might bring and the position you want your company to have 10 years down the road, you can actually have a more sort of a slower, more steady, deliberate pace of change in your organization gradually over that 10-year period, rather than waiting until 2030 for your holy cow moment. Right?
Yeah, right. So it's good that you mentioned Amazon and also about the pace, because I've got two questions that I think I'm going to combine. So one is so the Amazon used to be a bookstore. I think they started, but they're now already large in many industries. So will their growth and influence be restricted at some points by governments? And in connection to that, the other obstacles for change and innovations, like the law, like politics.